Hello and welcome to History at Midnight. Imagine a city so rich that travelers believed its streets were paved with gold. A city standing between two continents, protected by enormous walls that had resisted invaders for nearly 1,000 years. A place where merchants from every corner of the known world crowded its harbors, where emperors ruled beneath glittering domes, and where the scent of incense, silk, and spices filled the air. By all logic, this city should have been impossible to conquer. And yet, for centuries, the fate of empires revolved around it. This is the story of Constantinople. So, how did this magnificent city become the heart of the Byzantine Empire? How did it survive wave after wave of sieges from Persians, Arabs, Vikings, Crusaders, and Ottomans? And how did it become the richest and most desired city in the medieval world? Tonight, we will walk through the golden halls of emperors and stand beneath the shadow of the great Hagia Sophia. We will watch merchant ships glide into the Golden Horn carrying treasures from Asia and Africa. We will follow soldiers onto the towering Theodosian walls as enemy armies gather outside the gates. And we will witness the final days of an empire that called itself Roman long after Rome itself had fallen. This is a story of wealth and ambition, faith and conquest, survival and decline. It is the story of the city known as the Queen of Cities, the crossroads of the world, and the last great jewel of the ancient Roman Empire. But before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it truly means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a time of imperial banners, candlelit cathedrals, crowded marketplaces, and the distant echo of church bells across the waters of Constantinople. The story of Constantinople, or modern-day Istanbul, is a fascinating one that dates back millennia to the time when this megacity was a small Greek town known as Byzantium. The relatively modest Greek settlement of ancient times underwent a stunning transformation that would influence not only the course of the settlement itself and the surrounding areas but also the course of history on a more global stage. As we all know, Byzantium was destined to become the mighty Constantinople, one of the world's most magnificent cities and the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire. The story begins in the 7th century BC, when Greek settlers from Megara, a town near Athens, established Byzantium at the entrance of the Black Sea. The name Byzantium stems from Byzas, the son of the king of Megara, Nisos. It was the former who led the group of Greek settlers to the modern-day area of Istanbul. The Greek settlers decided to settle down there because it was strategically located along the Bosphorus Strait, connecting the Black Sea with the Aegean and Mediterranean. This location proved to be especially strategic, as it was at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, with vital commercial routes connecting the Mediterranean and Black Seas. It was quite literally the epicenter of contemporary global trade routes. However, Byzantium did not flourish instantly. The city's fate changed radically in 324 AD, nearly 1,000 years after its inauguration, when Roman Emperor Constantine I chose this historic place as the location for his new imperial capital. Within a mere 6 years, the city transformed into Constantinople, thus named after the emperor himself. It was officially inaugurated as the new Roman capital on May 11, 330 AD, altering the history of the world. This defining move was far from arbitrary or random. The position of Byzantium, later Constantinople, provided tremendous military and commercial benefits over other locations within the Roman Empire. The city had natural harbors, ensuring a consistent supply of wheat and other essentials that guaranteed the population not only food security but also great trade opportunities for merchants of the time. The city's geographical location, surrounded by the Sea of Marmara and the Golden Horn Bay, made it inherently defendable too, something that proved invaluable on many occasions during the tumultuous history of Constantinople. The Roman emperor spared no expense in revamping the city and converting it from a small Greek town to the mighty capital of the Roman Empire. Constantine ordered magnificent reinforced walls to be constructed, a massive hippodrome seating over 80,000 people, and a new central square known as the Augusteum that would inspire awe both in its inhabitants and visitors. The city also had a large imperial palace with an outstanding chalke entrance, as well as numerous public sites appropriate for an imperial capital worthy of its fame. Constantinople became the world's first Christian capital, owing to Constantine's momentous decision to personally convert to Christianity himself. One could argue that the urban ideology of Constantinople was carefully planned out to combine religious elements through the symbolic establishment of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in conjunction with the mighty imperial power. This is why Roman, Byzantine, emperors were referred to as the Lord's Anointed, and linked to biblical heroes, as they became the default defenders of Christ's faith in this world. The new Roman capital produced an extraordinary cultural synthesis that merged elements of antiquity with the emerging reality of Christian dominance. By maintaining Greek cultural traditions and incorporating Roman political structures and Christian religious practices, the city flourished. The population of Constantinople quickly increased, amounting to almost 400,000 by the 6th century, a number unheard of at the time. Constantinople and its establishment as the new Roman capital pushed the empire's power center eastward and led to Greece's first long-term union, as the empire was quickly Hellenized. Furthermore, the city established a monetary standard through Constantine's gold solidus, which remained in circulation for nearly a millennium. The concept of the divine right of monarchs as defenders of faith rather than solely divine rulers was also quite significant in the overall workings of the city. Constantinople remained the beacon of civilization across the eastern Mediterranean during the Middle Ages. Its libraries housed several ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts, while its workshops produced complex pieces of art and handicrafts that paved the way for later admirable masterpieces. This new Rome would last for more than 1,000 years prior to its eventual collapse to the Ottoman Empire in 1453. In 657 BC, the ruler Byzas from the ancient Greek city of Megara founded a settlement on the western side of the Strait of Bosporus, which linked the Black Sea with the Mediterranean Sea. Thanks to the pristine natural harbor created by the Golden Horn, Byzantium, or Byzantium, grew into a thriving port city. Over the following centuries, Byzantium was alternately controlled by the Persians, Athenians, Spartans and Macedonians as they jockeyed for power in the region. The city was destroyed by Roman Emperor Septimius Severus around AD 196, but subsequently was rebuilt with some of the structures that survived into the Byzantine Empire, including the baths of Zosippus, the hippodrome and a protective wall. After defeating his rival Licinius to become sole emperor of the Roman Empire in AD 324, Constantine I decided to establish a new capital at Byzantium called Nova Roma, New Rome. Constantine set about expanding the territory of Old Byzantium, dividing it into 14 sections and constructing a new outer wall. He lured noblemen through gifts of land, and transferred art and other ornaments from Rome for display in the new capital. Its wide avenues were lined by statues of great rulers like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, as well as one of Constantine himself as Apollo. The emperor also sought to populate the city through offering residents free food rations. With a system of aqueducts already in place, he ensured access to water through the widening city by the construction of the Binberdurek cistern. In AD 330, Constantine established the city that would make its mark in the ancient world as Constantinople, but also would become known by other names, including the Queen of Cities, Istanbul, Stambul and Istanbul. It would be governed by Roman law, observe Christianity and adopt Greek as its primary language, although it would serve as a melting pot of races and cultures due to its unique geographic location straddling Europe and Asia. Justinian I, who reigned from AD 527 to 565, weathered the Nika revolt early in his tenure and used the occasion to undertake extensive renovations of the city. He launched successful military campaigns that helped the Byzantines reclaim territories lost with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, expanding its borders to encircle the Mediterranean Sea. Additionally, Justinian established a uniform system of law with the Justinian Code, which would serve as a blueprint for civilizations to come. Along with spurring the spread of iconoclasm in the empire, Leo III, who ruled from AD 717 to 741, fought off an Arab siege of the city and stabilized the throne after recent years of upheaval. He was the first emperor of the Isaurian dynasty. Similarly, Basil I, who ruled from AD 867 to 886, launched what became the 2-century-long Macedonian dynasty. Despite his illiteracy, he followed Justinian by undertaking renovations and attempting further codification of laws, and successfully pushed the empire's borders south. Constantinople endured for more than 1,100 years as the Byzantine capital, in large part due to the protective wall completed under Theodosius II in 413. Expanding the city perimeter west from Constantine's wall by approximately a mile, the new one stretched 3.5 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. A double set of walls was added after a series of earthquakes in the mid-5th century, the inner layer standing some 40 feet high and studded with towers that reached another 20 feet. The Hippodrome, originally built by Severus in the 3rd century and expanded by Constantine, served as an arena for chariot races and other public events such as parades and displaying of the emperor's captive enemies. More than 400 feet long, it's estimated to have seated up to 100,000 people. The Hagia Sophia marked a triumph of architectural design. Built on the site of former imperial churches by Justinian I, it was completed in less than 6 years by a workforce of 10,000 laborers. 4 columns supported a massive dome with a diameter of more than 100 feet, while its polished marble and dazzling mosaics gave the Hagia Sophia the impression of always being brightly lit. Less is known of Constantine's imperial palace, which also figured prominently in the heart of the city, but it featured an elaborate display of mosaics, as well as a grand entrance known as the Chulke Gate. While Constantine's founding of New Rome coincided with efforts to establish Christianity as the state religion, that didn't formally happen until after Theodosius I ascended to power in 379. He convened the First Council of Constantinople in 381, which supported the Council of Nicaea of 325, and declared the city patriarch as second in power only to Rome's. Constantinople became a center of the iconoclast controversy after Leo III in 730 outlawed the worshipping of religious icons. Although the Seventh Ecumenical Council of 787 reversed that decision, iconoclasm resumed as a rule of law less than 30 years later and lasted until 843. With the Great Schism of 1054, when the Christian Church split into Roman and Eastern divisions, Constantinople became the seat of the Eastern Orthodox Church, remaining so even after the Muslim Ottoman Empire took control of the city in the 15th century. While the early decades of an Ottoman Empire-ruled Constantinople were marked by the transformation of churches into mosques, Mehmed II spared the Church of the Holy Apostles and allowed a diverse population to remain. Following the conqueror, the most prominent ruler of the Ottomans was Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. Along with developing a series of public works, Suleiman transformed the judicial system, championed the arts and continued to expand the empire. In the 19th century, the declining Ottoman state underwent major changes with the implementation of the Tanzimat reforms, which guaranteed property rights and outlawed execution without a trial. Early in the following century, the Balkan Wars, World War I and the Greco-Turkish War wiped out the remains of the Ottoman Empire. The 1923 Treaty of Lausanne formally established the Republic of Turkey, which moved its capital to Ankara. Old Constantinople, long known informally as Istanbul, officially adopted the name in 1930. In the year 1081, the Norman Duke Robert Guiscard was preparing his most ambitious military expedition to date, to invade Byzantine Empire and fight his way to Constantinople. The Normans had already conquered the Byzantine outposts in Italy, and Guiscard knew that Byzantium did not have a naval force that could stop him from crossing the Adriatic Sea. It was during this moment of crisis that the Byzantine Empire turned to their vassal and old ally, the Maritime Republic of Venice. The Venetians did not hesitate to send a large squadron to the empire's rescue, for they would be getting in return some rewards that were pledged, others granted at once. All their desire would be satisfied and confirmed by Chrysobules, provided they were not in conflict with the interests of the Roman Empire. The story of the Venetian-Byzantine military alliance is a complex one, with many questions that need to be answered. What were the deeper political and economic reasons that pushed the Maritime Republic to send a powerful fleet in Adriatic waters? What were the Venetians hoping to achieve and what might have been their long-term objective? What evidence do we have from our chronicler sources about the naval battles that took place in 1081 and 1084 and how effective the presence of the Venetian fleet proved to be in defeating the Normans? What were the rewards the Venetians received from the empire, and what were the implications of the Chrysabule, imperial decree, issued in 1082 for the future political and economic relations between the two nations? I will also examine the continuation of the alliance into the 12th century and see how their relations developed. What caused the rivalry between them and set them down a course that would lead to the Fourth Crusade? The relationship between the Venetian Republic and Constantinople may have been affected by the sentiment of long tradition. In theory, both parties had close ties since the 5th century, with the latter becoming a part of the Byzantine Empire during Justinian's expeditions against the Ostrogoths in the second half of the 6th century. But it was based more firmly on realism. Trade was, perhaps, the most significant factor that brought these two parties together centuries ago, and for a good reason. Constantinople and the Byzantine ports of the eastern Mediterranean were the treasure houses of Venetian trade. The people of Venice took natural to the sea, and islands and settlements like Cidanova, Heraclea, Malamaco and Torcello became great trading stations long before the end of the 11th century. Along with the Campanian city of Amalfi, which, by the mid-11th century had reached the peak of its commercial activity with North Africa and Spain, were the two main trading partners of the empire in continental Italy. The Venetians quickly adapted to the larger role of middlemen between the east and west. Byzantine merchants would bring luxury goods from the east to the markets of Torcello, and Venetian traders would then distribute them in the west, in Italy, France and Germany. The Byzantines would take payment in the form of timber for shipbuilding, of slaves, metal, salt and fish, products that formed the staple diet of these islanders. And in 992 comes the first military commercial agreement between Byzantium and Venice, signed by Basil II and Peter II Orseolo, 991-1009, by which Venice promised naval assistance whenever the Byzantine emperors would plan to send an army in southern Italy in exchange for significant trading privileges in Constantinople and Abydos. But what prompted both parties' common interest to keep the Adriatic Sea clear of rival naval activity? The answer is geography and trade routes. To and from Venice, voyages both up and down the Adriatic Sea were made invariably along the Balkan coast unless a ship had business in one of the Italian ports. The Balkan coast has a large number of islands and ports for refuge and supplies, is backed by high mountains, and there are, generally, no dangerous shallows to hamper the approach of a ship. For the Venetians, the many islands and ports possessed or dominated by the city in the lagoons on the Balkan coast from the 11th century provided secure shelter and logistical facilities for their shipping. The sea routes as far south as Ragusa lay amongst the islands and channels very close to the mainland, while south of the Straits of Otranto lay inshore of Corfu, Cephalonia and Zante, all of which had their main medieval harbors on their east coasts. To secure these sea routes that formed the lifeline of its trade with the empire, Venice had to exhibit its might against any enemy naval activity that threatened to disrupt the normal flow of goods to and from its ports. This was made clear as early as the mid-9th century when Doge Orso I inflicted a defeat on the Arabs of Bari in 871 just off the coast of Taranto. The Slav pirates operating from some Dalmatian ports throughout the 10th century were finally neutralized in the year 1000, while Venice's sending of a mission to relieve Bari once again from the Arabs of Sicily in 1004 proved not only its capability to conduct its own foreign policy but also its resolve to keep both coasts of the Adriatic in safe hands. But what was the threat that the Normans posed for the Venetian trade in the second half of the 11th century? Since their emphatic victory over the papal army of Leo IX at Civitate in 1053, Norman expansion in continental Italy had reached its peak in 1071 with the three-year siege and eventual capitulation of the city of Bari, capital of the Byzantine Catepanate of Longobardia. One of the greatest challenges that the Normans had to face since their arrival in Italy, the transportation of a large armed force by sea, was also overcome in May 1061 when a Norman force under the leadership of Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger landed near Messina in Sicily, a feature of great significance for the evolution of military thinking in the Mediterranean that further enabled them to impose a naval blockade in Bari and Palermo, the capital of Muslim Sicily. With the Normans holding the Italian side of the Adriatic, they could threaten the Straits of Otranto. But their ambitions went further than that. In 1074 a Norman count, Amicus II of Molfetta and Giovinazzo attacked the Dalmatian coasts and allegedly even managed to capture the Croatian king Krasimir, with the only option left to Venice being the launch of a naval expedition to flush him out. But although Amicus was a freebooter, the threat posed by Robert Guiscard's plans was much greater. Although he advertised his expedition as a restoration mission for the deposed Byzantine Emperor Michael VII, that also had the full backing of Pope Gregory VII, Guiscard, was always thinking out some more ambitious project, and dreamed of ascending the throne himself, as Anna Komnena writes in the Alexiad. The imperial crown is certainly considered one of Robert Guiscard's ambitions, influenced by the Byzantine culture, language, state organization and economic prosperity, but it was mostly the empire's diplomatic involvement in the Apulian rebellions of the 1060s through the governor of Dyrrhachium and the quest for more lands for the land-hungry Apulian lords that drove the duke to launch his Illyrian campaign. Before arriving outside the walls of Dyrrhachium in June 1081, Robert Guiscard had already taken the capital city of Corfu, along with the port on the opposite Epirottic coast, Butrinto, probably intending to have it as a forward supply base, while another side expedition occupied the port of Venitza, Bundicia, further south into the Ambracicos Gulf. The loss of these forward bases, along with the threat posed against Dyrrhachium, the port of entry for the Via Egnatia that led through Thessalonica and Adrianople to Constantinople, and a city that also had a large population of Venetian and Amalfitane tradesmen, were very worrying developments for the Venetians. They could not permit them to have a free rein in the Adriatic and severely disrupt their trade with the East. For the empire, the Norman invasion of Illyria happened to coincide with a period of great military decline, a result of the defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 and the replacement of the old thematic and tagmatic units with mercenaries. The newly crowned emperor, Alexius I Comnenus, an able tactician and experienced in fighting with and against Western soldiers in the previous decade, took immediate steps to deal with the threat posed by Guiscard's armed forces. Concluding a peace treaty with the Seljuk Turks, thus recognizing that the latter posed a more serious threat and had to be dealt with in the long term, he understood that his first move should be to cut the Norman communication with Italy and trap the landing force from its main bases in Bari and Otranto. In theory, the role of intercepting any Norman invasion fleet would probably have been assigned to the provincial fleets of Dyrrhachium, Cephalonia and, perhaps, Nicopolis, that consisted of rather light ships not suitable for open-sea expeditions. But the major naval bases in Cephalonia, Dyrrhachium and Corfu had been abandoned, thus allowing only a small squadron of ships to patrol the area with no immediate effect. The years when Constantinople could launch large-scale expeditions against Crete, 961, Cyprus, 965, and Sicily, 1038, have come and gone. After 1025, the Pax Romana that had been established in the Byzantine seas turned the attention of the central government away from the seas, prompting a steady decline in the strength of both the imperial and thematic fleets. The final blow came with their transformation from military to administrative provinces in the 1040s, as it was the case with the Landamata in Asia Minor. Alexia's decision to call for the empire's faithful ally, Venice, was brought by reality and, perhaps, desperation. The Byzantine government was not only considering Venice as an early warning beacon for threats coming from the north and some sort of a buffer zone for its Dalmatian territories. It had used the Venetian fleets to patrol the Adriatic, transport Byzantine troops to and from Italy and Sicily and provide naval support to imperial expeditions in the same region as early as 827 when the Muslims were besieging Syracuse. And it was the empire's strategic position, obliging her to fight in two distant operational theaters of war, Asia Minor and the Balkans, along with its limited resources in money and manpower that prompted the use of diplomacy, bribery, fraud and other means to avoid war. In other words, the Byzantines were more willing to have others to fight their wars than send naval detachments in a region far away from their main operational theaters closer to the capital. And as long as they provided them with rewards, the Venetians were more than willing to play that role. But what evidence do we get from our chronicler sources about Venice's involvement in the siege of Dyrrhachium in 1081 and 1084? Our two main sources for the naval battles between the Venetians and the Normans in 1081 are Anna Komnena, the daughter of the Emperor Alexius writing between 1143–48, and Geoffrey Malaterra, a monk commissioned by Roger Hauteville to write the conquest of Sicily by the Normans in the later years of the 11th century. Malaterra's sources for his work, for he was not an eyewitness himself to the events he describes in his history, were primarily oral, gathered from people who had witnessed the events, although we cannot be sure whether he had access to any archival material. Anna may not have been an eyewitness of the events, but her position in the imperial court brought her in daily contact with many leading figures of the empire. Apart from her father and emperor, she also had access to several other important officials like her uncle and governor of Dyrrhachium George Paleologos, while she was able to gather useful information from eyewitnesses of the events and gain access to archived material in the capital. The accounts of the ensuing naval battle between the Venetian squadron that arrived in the Illyrian waters, sometime in late July or early August, and the Normans are rather contradictory. According to the Alexiad, when the Venetian fleet arrived north of the besieged city, they refused battle on the first day. And while they prepared the fleet during the night for the next day's naval confrontation, having wooden towers erected on the main mast and manned with experienced men, there was a fierce battle between the two fleets. But the Normans were unable to break the solid Venetian sea harbor, meaning the defensive formation where the biggest and strongest vessels were tied tightly together providing shelter for the smaller vessels, and they were eventually routed. Malaterra had a rather different story to tell, presenting the Venetians as a cunning and crafty enemy. The Normans immediately attacked the Venetians once they realized their arrival in Illyrian waters, and after a most violent naval battle, by sunset the Normans seemed to had won the day. The Venetians, promising to surrender the next day, asked for a truce, but during that night they erected wooden towers in the ship's main masts and made their vessels lighter and, thus, more maneuverable. By sunrise, the reorganized Venetian squadron attacked the unprepared Normans, forcing them to retreat while they were breaking the naval blockade imposed to the city, making effective use of the Greek fire. We cannot be certain as to which of these accounts is the most accurate, but it seems more likely that Anna's story is closer to the truth if we think about not only her sources, her father and her uncle, but also the fact that she is much better informed about the Norman operations in the Balkans as a whole than any of her Italian counterparts. Whatever the case, the role played by the Venetian navy in 1081 was paramount for the imposition of a naval blockade on Guiscard's expeditionary force, cutting them off from their bases in Italy. If Alexius had chosen to impose a land blockade as well, like he did 26 years later, the outcome of the campaign would have been different. The Venetians had promptly and willingly played their part as imperial allies, but it was no fault of their own that Dyrrhachium eventually fell to the Norman duke. And while Guiscard was busy in Italy and his son was campaigning freely in Greece, they sent another fleet to dislodge the Norman garrison from Dyrrhachium, failing though, but establishing a base in the lower part of the city to keep their enemies occupied. For the second Norman expedition in the Balkans, Robert Guiscard departed from Brindisi at the end of September/early October 1084 with a fleet of 120 ships, landing at the northern port of Cassiope in Corfu just like he had done in 1081. The only difference this time was that he found a joined Venetian-Byzantine fleet waiting to attack him. We are not informed about the number of ships that were sent by the Doge, but we should not expect a large expeditionary force since it only took the Venetians a few weeks to prepare and sail south. Our sources use vague terms like triremes and naves to describe the consistency of the Venetian fleet, although by reading the Alexiad we understand that both large vessels, like Calandia, or types of dramans, and lighter and faster ships, like the Gallii, would have been deployed. We follow Anna Comnena's narrative about the naval engagement off Cassiope in the northeastern side of the island of Corfu. During their first encounter, the Venetians managed to rout the Norman squadron, but Anna gives us few if any details about the course of the battle. 3 days later the Allied fleet attacked the Normans once more, trying to inflict a significant blow upon the relatively small Norman squadron of warships, but again their victory was not decisive enough to force Robert Guiscard to retreat back to Avlona. This time, however, the Venetians made the grave mistake of underestimating the enemy's losses and they sent envoys to Venice to announce the news. With their small and fast ships sent back home, the Normans attacked. Completely surprised, the Venetians barely had the time to tie their ships together and form the Pelagolimena, the defensive formation seen 3 years before at Dyrrhachium. The Norman ships, being made much lighter the day before, took full advantage of their speed and mobility and overwhelmingly defeated the Allied fleet. For Venice this was a crushing and humiliating defeat. Anna mentions around 13,000 casualties, which is surely an exaggerated figure, and 2,500 prisoners. Lupus Protospatharius, whose chronic covers the period between 805-1102, writes about more than 1,000 men killed in action, 5 ships captured by the Normans and 2 which were sunk with their entire crew, a much more realistic estimate for the Venetian casualties. As for the treatment of the prisoners by the Normans, Anna reports, many of the prisoners were treated with hideous savagery, some were blinded, others had their noses cut off, and others lost hands or feet or both. There was no precedent in Robert Guiscard's behavior against prisoners of war, neither at Dyrrhachium 3 years ago nor against the Bariates, the Palermitans, or the people of Naples in the 1070s. Probably the Duke wished to send a warning to the Venetians never to launch another naval campaign against his army. This gruesome method of psychological warfare proved very effective by Roger after the Battle of Misilmeri, 1068, when hardly any Muslims survived to bring the news of their defeat to the inhabitants of the Sicilian capital. In the longer term the Norman victory was of no importance, as Guiscard's expedition reached an abrupt end with the latter's death in July 1085. But the Venetians expected their reward for all the sacrifices they had made as allies of Byzantium. The text of the Crucible which Alexius had promised to them in 1081 exists, albeit in an incomplete Latin version contained in later documents and in a brief summary in the Alexiad. Although there has been a debate regarding the dating of the document to 1082 or 1084, its content is the most comprehensive and detailed charter of privileges that had ever been granted to the Republic by a Byzantine emperor, thus forming the cornerstone of the Venetian colonial empire in the eastern Mediterranean. The Crucible of 992 may had granted the Venetians the privilege of having to pay their dues only to the highest official of the state, but now they were getting a permanent colony of resident traders on the Golden Horn, a number of buildings, churches, and other properties were designated as Venetian and they also earned the right to trade in all parts of the empire free of any charge, tax or duty payable to the imperial treasury. The Crucible made the Venetians feel that their sacrifices in the war against the Normans were worth the cost. It was a document designed to bring them back in Byzantine orbit, not as faithful subjects but rather as dependable allies by giving them the ability to open the door to the wealth of Byzantium and the Orient, and they made sure that these privileges were renewed and extended at intervals. Until the eve of the launching of the Fourth Crusade, Venice and Byzantium were partners in an alliance that had grown steadily for centuries. They both needed each other, though for different reasons. The Byzantines saw Venice as an early warning beacon and a sort of a buffer zone in the Adriatic, while its ships provided valuable transport means for imperial expeditions and patrolled the Adriatic, tasks which the Byzantine navy was growing increasingly incapable of performing after the second half of the 11th century. Venice's economy relied on trade and all of the trade routes passed through the Adriatic Sea and the Aegean to Constantinople, the capital and economic heartland of the Byzantine Empire, the gateway for products coming from the Orient that Venice was distributing in the West. The Doges were keen to keep the Adriatic free from enemy activity that could hamper their trade, but more and more on their own behalf rather than for the sake of the Byzantines. Their fleet was sent to assist the imperial forces on several occasions since the mid-9th century, with their naval campaign against the Normans in Dyrrhachium in 1081-4 earning them by far the most significant concessions ever made by a Byzantine emperor to the date. Crude tradesmen as they were, the Venetians were always thinking twice as to which side to take and being careful not to alienate a party with which they wished to conduct business with. Their reluctance to join the cause of the First Crusade as they were trading with both Byzantium and Fatimid Egypt is characteristic. Indeed, the stable markets of Constantinople and Alexandria seemed preferable than the uncertainties of the markets in the Middle Eastern ports. They also seemed quite adaptable to the changes in the pattern of alliances in the Adriatic, keen to demonstrate to both the East and West the fact that they were able to conduct their own foreign policy. It was they who proposed an anti-Norman coalition to the Byzantine Emperor John Comnenus in 1136, suffering great injustice by the piratical attacks of the Muslims of Jebba, in the Tunisian coast who were paying tribute to the Normans, but really worrying about the resurgence of the naval power of the Sicilian Normans in the Adriatic, the central Mediterranean and Antioch. However, according to charter evidence, it was Roger II who bought them over with trading privileges in 1137, thus detaching them from the alliance which by that time had also included Lothair of Germany. 10 years later, once again due to the Norman threat in the Adriatic, they detached a naval squadron to participate in the imperial campaign to dislodge the Norman garrison installed in Corfu, with some 13th-century Venetian chroniclers reporting significant number of vessels and siege machines being brought to the island. But in 1154, they advertised their neutrality by negotiating treaties with William I of the Kingdom of Sicily and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, much to the surprise of Manuel Comnès. Their greatest asset in Byzantium was their commercial quarter in Constantinople, the center of their trading power in the capital, which was established by Alexius Chrysobule in 1082. It was there, however, that they rubbed shoulders with the Byzantine people and earned a reputation for arrogance. Indeed, we read Cognate's description of the Venetians: they are beggars, cunning in thought, and surrounding themselves with wealth, they pursue insolence and impudence, which is not as objective as we might expect but quite characteristic of the Byzantine view of this seafaring people. Emperor Manuel, 1143–1180, had extended the limits of their quarter in Constantinople after they had complained that the part allotted to them by his predecessors was not big enough. The number of Venetian traders and merchantmen had grown significantly in the last century, although not as much as the figure of 10,000 given by Doge Dandolo. The emperors hoped that the Venetians would be restricted to the areas allocated to them, some sort of a ghetto, like the residents of other naval powers like Amalfi, Genoa and Pisa. But this did not happen. The mutual animosity between the Byzantines and the Venetians was made obvious during the reign of John II, 1118–1143. For the Byzantine emperors, the commercial agreements and privileges dispensed to the Republic were the means of perpetuating a valuable partnership for mutual assistance against the Muslims and the Normans of the Mediterranean. And it was John's denial to renew his father's agreement with Venice that brought to the surface not just the emperor's frustration for the lawlessness and arrogant behavior of the Venetians, but his will to underline the fact that Byzantium was the senior partner in the arrangement and not an equal member. Eventually, the Doge's punitive naval expeditions in the Ionian and the Aegean seas in 1124 with some 100 ships and 15,000 men forced John to concede that the Byzantine forces were not up to the task to either patrol the Byzantine seas or control the Venetian navy. It seemed better to make peace with that power in the hope that it could be called as an ally in the future, than risk a war. Alexius Comnès had given the Venetians the right to trade freely in Byzantine ports in Greece and Asia Minor. John II had extended that right to the islands of Crete and Cyprus, a concession which facilitated trade with Egypt and the Middle East, perhaps unwittingly opening the door to a vision of almost unlimited and highly privileged trade and profit for Venice in the eastern Mediterranean. The renewing of the commercial agreements may have fallen on the discretion of each emperor. By the third quarter of the 12th century it seemed clear that Byzantium was losing control of its one trusted and faithful ally, which can be more than vividly demonstrated by the events that unfolded in the capital in 1171 and 1182. And although the three chrysobules issued by Isaac II, 1185–1195, 1203–1204, in 1187 did little to redress the relations between the two parties, the balance of power was now weighted in favor of Venice. Emperors like John II and Alexius III, 1195–1202, tried to offset the power of Venice by signing trading agreements with Pisa and Genoa, but their attempts were in vain. Although Venice's greed was growing, its patience was steadily running low, with the Fourth Crusade offering them the opportunity to right the wrongs done to their profit and honor. This was, indeed, the most expensive and risky gamble the Venetians had ever taken. But it paid off unbelievably well. For 56 years they did not have to worry about protecting their trade agreements with the empire. It was simply, as David Nicol puts it, a fruitful combination of state and private enterprise which amassed untold wealth to the city of Venice. For how long it lasted, the Latin Empire of Constantinople was by far the most profitable investment the Venetians had ever underwritten. For 400 years the Adriatic itself had been ruled from Rome, for another 600 the sea, and Venice itself, had been subject to Rome's Greek-speaking successor, the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. By the year 1000, this power was starting to wane, and the Venetians were engaged in a stealthy act of substitution. In the small stone cathedrals of Zara, Spalato, Istria, and Trau, the Venetian doge was remembered in prayers only after the name of the emperor in Constantinople, but this practice was, simply, a ritual. The emperor was far away, his power no longer stretched much north of Corfu, at the gates of the Adriatic, and along the Italian shore. The lords of Dalmatia were in all fact the Venetians. The power vacuum created by weakening Byzantine control would allow Venice to move up the scale progressively from subjects to equal partners and finally, in tragic circumstances, to usurpers of the Byzantine Sea. The lords of the Dalmatian coast were embarked on the ascent. The relationship between Byzantium and Venice was one of intense complexity and longevity, chafed by mutually contradictory views of the world and subject to wild mood swings, yet Venice always looked to Constantinople. This was the great city of the world, the gateway to the east. Through its warehouses on the Golden Horn flowed the wealth of the wider world, Russian furs, wax, slaves, and caviar, spices from India and China, ivory, silk, precious stones, and gold. Out of these materials, Byzantine craftsmen fashioned extraordinary objects, both sacred and profane, reliquaries, mosaics, chalices chased with emeralds, costumes of shot silk, that formed the taste of Venice. The astonishing Basilica of St. Mark, reconsecrated in 1094, was designed by Greek architects on the pattern of the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. Its artisans recounted the story of St. Mark, stone by stone, in imitation of the mosaic styles of St. Sophia, Hagia Sophia. Its goldsmiths and enamelers created the Palla d'Oro, the golden altarpiece, a miraculous expression of Byzantine devotion and art. The whiff of spices on the quays of Venice had been carried 1,000 miles from the godowns of the Golden Horn. Constantinople was Venice's souk, where its merchants gathered to make, and lose, fortunes. As loyal subjects of the emperor, the right to trade in his lands was always their most precious possession. He, in turn, used this privilege as the bargaining chip to rein in his uppity vassals. In 991 Orseolo gained valuable trading rights for Venetian support in the Adriatic. 25 years later they were technically withdrawn again in a spat. Differing attitudes to commerce marked a sharp dividing line. From early on, the amoral trading mentality of the Venetians, the assumed right to buy and sell anything to anyone, shocked the pious Byzantines. Around 820 the emperor complained bitterly about Venetian cargoes of war materials, timber, metal, and slaves, to his enemy, the Sultan in Cairo. But in the last quarter of the 11th century the Byzantine Empire, such a durable presence in the Mediterranean basin, started to decline, and the balance of power began tilting in Venice's favor. In the 1080s the Venetians defended the empire in the Adriatic against powerful Norman war bands, intent on taking Constantinople itself. Their reward was sumptuous. With all the imperial pomp of Byzantine ritual, the emperor affixed his golden seal, the Bulla Aurea, to a document that would change the sea forever. He granted the city's merchants the rights to trade freely, exempt from tax, throughout his realms. A large number of cities and ports were specified by name: Athens and Salonika, Thebes and Antioch and Ephesus, the islands of Chios and Euboea, key harbors along the coasts of southern Greece such as Modon and Coron, invaluable staging posts for Venetian galleys, but above all, Constantinople itself. Here, Venice was given a prize site down by the Golden Horn. It included 3 quays, a church and bakery, shops and warehouses for storing goods. Though nominal subjects of the emperor, the Venetians had effectively acquired their own colony, with all the necessary infrastructure, in the heart of the richest city on earth, under extremely favorable conditions. Only the Black Sea, Constantinople's grain basket, was barred to the avid traders. Quietly echoing among the solemn, convoluted lines of the Byzantine decree was the sweetest Greek word a Venetian might ever want to hear: monopoly. Venice's jostling rivals in maritime trade, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi, were now put at such disadvantage that their presence in Constantinople was almost futile. The Golden Bull of 1082 was the golden key that opened up the treasure house of Eastern trade for Venice. Its merchants flocked to Constantinople. Others started to permeate the small ports and harbors of the eastern seaboard. By the second half of the 12th century, Venetian merchants were visible everywhere in the eastern Mediterranean. Their colony in Constantinople grew to around 12,000 and, decade by decade, the trade of Byzantium imperceptibly passed into their hands. They not only funneled goods back to an avid market in continental Europe, they acted as intermediaries, restlessly shuttling back and forth across the ports of the Levant, buying and selling. Their ships triangulated the eastern seas, shipping olive oil from Greece to Constantinople, buying linen in Alexandria and selling it to the Crusader states via Acre, touching Crete and Cyprus, Smyrna and Salonika. At the mouth of the Nile, in the ancient city of Alexandria, they bought spices in exchange for slaves, endeavoring at the same time to perform a nimble balancing act between the Byzantines and the Crusaders on one hand and their enemy, the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, on the other. With each passing decade, Venice was sinking its tentacles deeper into the trading posts of the East. Its wealth saw the rise of a new class of rich merchants. Many of the great families of Venetian history began their ascent to prominence during the boom years of the 12th century. The period heralded the start of commercial dominance. Constantinople is one of those rare places in medieval European history, at times perhaps the only place, where one could find the kind of urban scale familiar in antiquity. This made life different in Constantinople than other former Roman cities. One could find things lost in the West, especially on this scale, such as a large functioning hippodrome, multiple Roman forums, a colonnaded main street, the Misi, large cisterns, a functioning aqueduct, triumphal arches and columns, multiple harbors, large public buildings, countless large churches and monasteries, a high quantity of ancient statues and sculptures, a vast Roman imperial palace complex, as well as wealth and population on a level lost in other cities since antiquity. It is unknown if the forums, such as the Forum of Constantine, actually still had their columns in the medieval period. Oosterhout argues, in agreement with Cyril Mango, that Basil I built a church there, dedicated to the Virgin, having observed that the workers lacked both a place of spiritual refuge and somewhere to go to get out of the rain. Cyril Mango views this statement as significant in that it suggests that the church had replaced all other centers of social gathering. At the same time, it implies that the arcades and porticos, which were part and parcel of the late antique city, no longer existed. So it is possible that although Constantinople certainly resembled a late antique city far more than Western medieval cities, that it had lost some of that late antique splendor as well. My guess is by the Comnenian era in some areas there were colonnaded streets, but not as much as the time of Justinian. When we today think of the city, we mostly think of its monuments which captivate our imaginations and also leave traces in either material and/or literary form for us to analyze. But how much do New Yorkers today really think of the Statue of Liberty in their daily lives? For a resident of Constantinople, the Column of Constantine was probably something like that. The Hagia Sophia would of course be magical, but also taken for granted in the skyline by local residents. For most of the Middle Ages the people in the other cities of Europe were not exposed to such grand structures in their cities at all, let alone on the scale of Constantinople. The skyline of Constantinople certainly would have been dominated by churches everywhere. William of Tyre recorded the visit during the reign of Manuel Comnenos of the King of Jerusalem, Amalric, d. 1174, who was escorted throughout the whole city both within the walls and without. He visited the churches and monasteries of which there was an almost infinite number. Villehardouin, recording a history of the Fourth Crusade, wrote about the skyline of Constantinople as they approached it by sea. I can assure you those who had never seen Constantinople before gazed very intently upon the city, having never imagined there could be such a fine place in all the world. They noted the high walls and lofty towers encircling it, and its rich palaces and tall churches, of which there were so many no one would have believed it to be true if he had not seen it with his own eyes. This is telling of how unique Constantinople was as a city. The large metropolis was not a common feature in the medieval world. One would have to travel to the Islamic world to find the closest cities of the same caliber. Thus, life in the city was unique by the standards of the time. Constantinople was relatively speaking fairly demilitarized. The people of the city were not very well armed either. The maximum garrison in normal times for the city was around 4,000 men, but often less than that. The palace guards were there, but they really guarded the imperial palace, which had its own walls and grounds. Of course, if there was a threat to the city itself, the palace guards could be sent to the walls to help aid in the defense of the city. Or they could be used to eliminate any threats or uprisings, as Belisarius did when he massacred tens of thousands of civilians in the Hippodrome during the Nika riots. But that kind of massacre was not the norm in Byzantine politics. Justinian was unique to survive such turmoil through his calculated carnage. Of course, any city requires security, but Constantinople had different security needs and risks than the smaller towns which were in the rest of the Byzantine Empire and in Western Europe. There was never a massive army garrisoned inside Constantinople unless the city faced an enemy army or rebellion which required defensive action. The Central Imperial Army, known as the Tagmata, was stationed in various different areas around northwest Anatolia and Thrace and only gathered together when needed for campaign. Keeping a large army in Constantinople would have made it very easy for the army to overthrow emperors from inside, instead of having the Theodosian walls between them and the emperor. Constantinople, as an international trade center, spiritual center, as well as the capital of a large empire, for most of its existence at least, was very diverse. There were different ethnic groups and languages to be seen and heard around the city. You might see Western pilgrims coming to see a relic of a famous saint. Unusually for Christian medieval Europe, there was even a mosque in Constantinople. There was a Jewish community as well. One could find Latin knights looking to serve as mercenaries for the emperor. Italian sailors may be seen waiting at the harbors looking for work in the navy or in trade. One might see an Arab trader renting a warehouse from a Roman selling goods to a Varangian trader, for example. But the city was multidimensional in other aspects as well. There was also a lot of provincial immigration to Constantinople, the most common form of immigration to the city. Let's say, for example, a Roman farm is sacked by the Arabs in Anatolia. Their son was taken as a slave, which means you do not have the labor needed to restart. They may feel forced to sell or abandon their farm and move to Constantinople to try their luck in the city. Sometimes the emperors would forcibly relocate provincial citizens to keep the population up, such as Constantine V in the 8th century. Constantinople also had an intrinsic need for immigrants as well, as you will see below in the section on disease and death. However, despite the many foreigners that may have visited Constantinople, it was less diverse in terms of residents than many people seem to think. Anthony Kaldelis believes this is a projection of the Ottoman era onto Byzantine history. All residents spoke Greek, and likely many of the traders who frequented the city. By 600 AD, Latin was pretty much irrelevant and largely gone from the city. Outsiders were often seen unfavorably, even those from within the borders of the empire. The Isaurians were not seen as Romans. The Egyptians were mentioned in the source with negative connotations. The government paid attention to foreigners and what their objectives were. Anthony Kaldelis wrote that Constantinople was not an open city that foreign groups could approach, enter, and live in at will. Approaches by sea, the most common, were monitored by the toll and customs stations in the Hellespont and Bosphorus, which made sure no one was bringing weapons to the city or attempting to enter without proper documents. This shows that travel to Constantinople by foreigners required justification. There were trade treaties which gave certain peoples in Byzantine history, such as Italians or Rus, special privileges. But Constantinople has a long history, so at some times the diversity clearly went up. The 12th century saw a dramatic increase in the amount of resident Italians in Constantinople. They were mostly along the Golden Horn, and were primarily from Amalfi, Pisa, Venice, and Genoa. There was some tension against foreigners in later Byzantine eras, particularly the Italians for their growing power and wealth in Byzantine society. People did not enjoy seeing them wield such influence, independence, and power inside Constantinople. Sadly, disease was a huge part of life throughout most of human existence. In fact, even today with modern medicine any of us can succumb to some kind of health issue. Though the Byzantines had advanced medicine by the standards of the time, life was short in this time. Anthony Kaldelis cites an estimate that densely populated pre-modern cities are believed to have lost around 1% of their population annually to disease. Therefore, in order to grow from 25,000 to 500,000 people in 210 years from 330 AD, 540 AD, Constantinople would have had to compensate for that loss and score a net gain on top of that. In other terms, if the city's population was 400,000 in the later 5th century, then it would have needed to import almost 10,000 new people every year to stay on track for its 500,000 apex in 541. The 1% figure is a regular year. During the periods of acute plague, the city could see dramatic scenes of mass death. During the Justinianic plague, the city would have been full of dead bodies all over the place. John of Ephesus says that 16,000 people died per day during the worst of the plague, with the death toll reaching 230,000. I do doubt that there could have been such an organized death counting process during such a time of societal chaos, though. To be clear, many scholars do not think that many people died, but no one truly knows. The Black Death also hit the city much later in its history. Life in Constantinople had a grand side, but also a darker, less beautiful dimension. For one, it was a metropolis, thus it had large amounts of poverty to go along with its extreme wealth. Odo of Duel, despite his bias against the Byzantines, probably gave a fair description of the less glamorous side of society. The city itself is squalid and fetid and in many places harmed by permanent darkness, for the wealthy overshadow the streets with buildings and leave these dirty, dark places to the poor and to travelers. Their murders and robberies and other crimes which love darkness are committed. This gives one a picture, like big cities today, where certain areas of the city are probably unsafe, poor, and relatively lawless in comparison to other parts. Ancient Rome had these issues as well. Odo of Duel did also admit that Constantinople was a great city, and, if she did not have these vices, however, she would be preferable to all other places. This estimation depends greatly on what time period you are focusing on the city. The population would rise and fall due to various factors. But life in the city would definitely be different based on its population at different times. According to Anthony Caldelas, the conventional estimation in the mid-6th century peak of the population was around 500,000 people, but estimates range from 400,000 to 750,000 people. Intriguingly, he offers some insight on how these estimates are crafted by scholars. Caldelas wrote that estimates are produced in 3 different ways: by guesswork, by correlating the size of the city with guesses about its population density, although it is not known how much of it was residential, and by calculating the number of people who could be fed by the shipments of Egyptian grain stipulated in Justinian's Edict 13.8 of c.539. The last produces larger estimates, but assumes Justinian's expectations were met and used only to feed Constantinople. Conventionally, 500,000 is understood as the high point in 541. In short, he says these estimations are just a bunch of reasoned guesses from scholars with the limited information we have. But, over time, the city did begin to shed people, and almost surely never hit 500,000 again. The Egyptian grain shipments which scholars used to estimate the population were lost in the 7th century. The Persians seized Egypt and the shipments halted around 619, though Egypt was briefly reconquered. After the Arab conquest in 642, Roman rule was permanently over in Egypt. The city population entered a downward spiral, possibly plummeting to as low as 70,000 people. The aqueduct network also ceased function in the 7th century, which limited the upper ceiling of the population. Now, despite the huge decreases of this century, Constantinople was still bigger than any other contemporary cities in medieval Europe. But, 70,000 inside a city which held at least 500,000 must have left many areas of urban ruins and cultivated land. After bottoming out as the empire nearly collapsed in the face of the Arab threat, Constantinople sort of reflected the situation of the Roman Empire. As the empire stabilized and recovered, so did the Queen of Cities. The growth was more gradual, though it seems it accelerated in the 11th century. The population is cited as being as high as 400,000 as per Geoffrey Villehardouin, who thoroughly destroyed the city with the Fourth Crusaders in 1204. Anthony Caldelas says it seems high, but does not specifically refute the number or offer an alternative. So it seems 300 to 400,000 is a reasonable estimate for the 12th century second peak of Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade shattered the fabric of the empire, and Constantinople in an irreversible and tragic way. The city population severely declined, as did its material wealth. It possibly went as low as 30,000 people. When the Romans liberated Constantinople in 1261, the city did rebound slightly, but the Romans did not possess the resources necessary to truly rebuild and restore the city to its former splendor. Anthony Caldelas says in the early 15th century there were around 70,000 people, while in 1453 the population was possibly as low as 25,000. The epic voyages of the Vikings to the British Isles, Iceland, North America and points west tend to obscure the fact that the Scandinavian warriors also ventured far to the east across Europe and parts of Asia. While the Danes and Norwegians sailed west, Swedish fighters and traders traveled in the opposite direction, enticed initially by the high-quality silver coins minted by the Abbasid Caliphate that sprawled across the Middle East. These Vikings who crossed the Baltic Sea and descended across Eastern Europe were branded Russ, possibly derived from ruotsi, a Finnish word for the Swedes meaning a crew of oarsmen, and the term from which Russia receives its name. As the Russ migrated down the Dnieper and Volga rivers, they established settlements along trade routes to the Black and Caspian Seas and conquered the native Slavic populations in present-day Russia, Belarus and Ukraine. By the middle of the 9th century, Rus merchants turned up in Baghdad. The capital of the Abbasid Caliphate may have been the world's largest city with a population of more than 1 million people, but it failed to capture the Viking imagination like Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire that was said to harbor even greater riches. Silk and gold are the big lures. The Rus would have heard stories about the riches of Constantinople. The big attraction in trade was silk, which was a massively prestigious product for which they traded slaves, furs, beeswax and honey with the Byzantines. Constantinople was also one of the few places that still had gold coins, which were in short supply compared to the Roman period. Constantinople's location on the shores of the Bosporus Strait, which divided Europe from Asia, allowed it to become a prosperous crossroads of trade, the largest city in Europe and the richest city in the world. Great treasures necessitated stout defenses. The most heavily fortified city in the world, Constantinople was encircled by a moat and 3 parallel walls. In addition, an iron chain that could be stretched across the mouth of the city's harbor protected it from a naval assault. It is not known when the Rus first reached Constantinople, but it was before 839 when Rus representatives arrived at the Frankish court as part of a Byzantine diplomatic mission. In June 860, the Rus launched a surprise attack on Constantinople at a time when the city was left largely undefended as Byzantine Emperor Michael III was off with his army fighting the Abbasid Caliphate in Asia Minor while the Byzantine navy was engaged with Arab pirates on the Mediterranean Sea. In what the Greek patriarch Photius called a thunderbolt from heaven, the Rus plundered the suburbs of Constantinople and launched coastal raids around the Sea of Marmara in which they burned houses, churches and monasteries and slaughtered the patriarch's servants. However, they never attempted to breach the city walls before suddenly departing in August. The Byzantines credited divine intervention, but the Rus likely departed to ensure they could arrive back home before winter set in. A medieval Russian source details a second attack on Constantinople in 907 when a fleet of 2,000 ships encountered the iron chain blockading the harbor entrance. The resourceful Vikings responded by going amphibious, hauling their ships ashore, affixing wheels and dragging them overland before placing them back in the water on the other side of the chain before being repelled by the Byzantines. No Byzantine accounts of a Viking attack in 907 exist, however, and Haywood notes that the story could have been concocted as a way to explain a subsequent trade agreement between the Rus and the Byzantines. In 941 the Rus launched a disastrous attack on Constantinople. With the Byzantine army and navy once again gone from the city, a fleet of 1,000 ships descended upon Constantinople only to be done in by 15 old dramans fitted with Greek fire projectors that set the Viking ships ablaze. Weighed down by their armor, the Rus who avoided the flames by jumping into the sea sank to a watery demise. Others caught fire as they swam. When Byzantine reinforcements finally arrived, the Rus sailed for home. A half-century later, the Vikings would be recruited to defend Constantinople instead of attacking it. When Byzantine Emperor Basil II faced an internal uprising in 987, Vladimir the Great gave him 6,000 Viking mercenaries known as Varangians to differentiate the native Scandinavians from the Rus who by the middle of the 10th century had assimilated with the native Slavs and lost their distinct identity. Impressed by the ferocity with which the Vikings battled the rebels, the emperor established the elite Varangian Guard to protect Constantinople and serve as his personal bodyguards. With no local ties or family connections that could divide their loyalties and an inability to speak the local language, the Varangians proved far less corruptible than Basil's Greek guards. They were immensely well rewarded, Haywood says of the Varangians. They were given silk for everyday wear. If you are Scandinavian at that time, you are doing well if you have silk trim on your clothes. They get an enhanced share of the booty. It's this trickle of well-to-do homecoming mercenaries that spreads this image of Constantinople as the promised land of fabulous wealth. The Varangian Guard fought in every major Byzantine campaign, from Sicily to the Holy Land, until Constantinople was captured by Crusaders in 1204. Visitors to one of the most famous sites in the city now known as Istanbul can see that the Vikings left their mark on Constantinople, literally. At least 2 runic inscriptions carved into the marble walls of the Hagia Sophia may have been engraved by members of the Varangian Guard. The Fall of Constantinople, May 29, 1453, Conquest of Constantinople by Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire. The dwindling Byzantine Empire came to an end when the Ottomans breached Constantinople's ancient land wall after besieging the city for 55 days. Mehmed surrounded Constantinople from land and sea while employing cannon to maintain a constant barrage of the city's formidable walls. The fall of the city removed what was once a powerful defense for Christian Europe against Muslim invasion, allowing for uninterrupted Ottoman expansion into Eastern Europe. By the mid-15th century, constant struggles for dominance with its Balkan neighbors and Roman Catholic rivals had diminished Byzantine imperial holdings to Constantinople and the land immediately west of it. Furthermore, with Constantinople having suffered through several devastating sieges, the city's population had dropped from roughly 400,000 in the 12th century to between 40,000 and 50,000 by the 1450s. Vast open fields constituted much of the land within the walls. Byzantine relations with the rest of Europe had soured over the last several centuries as well. The schism of 1054 and the 13th century Latin occupation of Constantinople entrenched a mutual hatred between the Orthodox Byzantines and Roman Catholic Europe. Nevertheless, just as deeply entrenched was the understanding that Byzantine control of Constantinople was a necessary bastion against Muslim control of land and sea in the eastern Mediterranean. In contrast to the Byzantines, the Ottoman Turks had extended their control over virtually all of the Balkans and most of Anatolia, having conquered several Byzantine cities west of Constantinople in the latter half of the 14th century. Constantinople itself became an Ottoman vassal during this period. Hungary was the primary European threat to the Ottomans on land, and Venice and Genoa controlled much of the Aegean and Black Seas. Sultan Murad II laid siege to Constantinople in 1422, but he was forced to lift it in order to suppress a rebellion elsewhere in the empire. In 1444 he lost an important battle to a Christian alliance in the Balkans and abdicated the throne to his son, Mehmed II. However, he returned to power 2 years later after defeating the Christians and remained sultan until his death in 1451. The resurgence of the Byzantine Empire from historical obscurity is akin to the phoenix's majestic rise, a narrative rich with perseverance and resilience amidst the volatile tides of time. This story, a vivid tapestry woven across eras, illustrates the complex interplay of power, faith, and culture on the grand stage of the medieval world. From the awe-inspiring spires of Constantinople to the remote reaches of its expansive realm, Byzantium stands as a guardian of civilization, overcoming odds to leave an indelible mark on the annals of human history. Emerging from the ruins of antiquity like a phoenix, the Byzantine Empire inherited the legacy of Rome, its destiny closely linked with its illustrious predecessor. Strategically positioned at the intersection of Europe and Asia, Constantinople blossomed into the vibrant heart of a diverse empire where East and West met in a symphony of cultures and ideas. Under the majestic dome of the Hagia Sophia, emperors wielded divinely sanctioned authority, while scholars and artisans created masterpieces of unparalleled beauty and complexity. The journey of Byzantium was fraught with challenges, external threats and internal strife constantly tested its resolve. Barbarian invasions pressed its borders, while political intrigue and internal discord threatened its stability from within. Despite these adversities, Byzantium persevered, its people unified by a shared identity and purpose that transcended the caprices of fortune. Central to the Byzantine narrative is an unwavering commitment to faith and tradition. The Orthodox Church, with its elaborate rituals and deep spirituality, served as the empire's spiritual cornerstone, guiding its subjects through turbulent times. Icons adorned the walls of its churches, their luminous images testifying to the enduring power of religious devotion in an uncertain age. The empire's greatest strength, perhaps, lay in its adaptability and innovation. From the creation of Greek fire, a terrifying weapon that struck fear into its enemies, to the sophisticated diplomacy that enabled it to navigate the perilous waters of medieval politics, Byzantium proved to be a master of survival in a constantly evolving world. However, even the formidable Byzantine Empire could not escape the relentless advance of time. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the relentless assault of the Ottoman Turks, its once impenetrable walls breached amid the conqueror's forces. The fall of Byzantium marked the end of an era, yet its legacy persisted, casting a long shadow over history. In the aftermath of its fall, the influence of Byzantium spread far and wide, shaping the course of history in profound and unexpected ways. Its scholars dispersed across the West, bringing with them the knowledge of antiquity that would fuel the Renaissance. Its art and architecture inspired countless generations of artists, from the iconic domes of St. Basil's Cathedral to the elegant arches of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. Today, the memory and imagination keep the Byzantine Empire alive, a testament to human resilience and perseverance. Its legacy, like the shimmering tiles of a Byzantine mosaic, continues to illuminate the pages of history, reminding us of the extraordinary heights that civilization can achieve when guided by vision, courage, and faith.